really happen very often, that they are relatively insignificant in the cosmic scheme of things, or that they make some vague and unspecified contribution to the overall goodness of the universe. Even if God is not the cause of such evils, why does God allow them at all? It is in replying to these specific questions around the relationship between virtue and flourishing that Maimonides finally appeals directly to the nature and mechanics of divine providence. Maimonides begins by rejecting 4 different views on providence. The Epicurean view is that there is no providence, and that everything happens as a result of the random permutations of matter. For Maimonides, this is a non-starter, since it is inconsistent with demonstrated metaphysical and theological principles. Second, there is the Aristotelian view that divine governance extends only to the everlasting and immutable elements of nature. The celestial spheres and their contents, as well as the species of things, are provided by God with what is necessary for their preservation. Individual existence, that is, individual existing things in this sublunary realm, are watched over by providence only to the extent that they are provided with certain essential attributes by the species to which they belong. Thus, a human being is endowed with reason and a variety of instincts, all of which aid their preservation by virtue of the species human being. Everything else that happens to a human being that does not flow from its species, however, that is, everything that does not belong to it essentially and by virtue of its being a human being, everything else is due to chance. While Maimonides does, for the most part, reject the Aristotelian view, he believes that there is indeed an element of truth to it, one that he will incorporate into his own account. The third account that he rejects is the Asherite theory of providence, according to which nothing in the universe is due to chance. Rather, everything is brought about through the will of God. Providence thus extends to every aspect of every event in nature, from the punishment of a sinner to the falling of a leaf from a tree. Maimonides insists that this account is unacceptable because it renders divine law useless, since no human being would have any freedom to do or to refrain from doing what the law commands or proscribes. It thus makes a mockery of divine justice. The fourth opinion also states that divine providence watches over all things, but adds that human beings are free in their actions. Moreover, God is responsible for distributing rewards and punishments to all beings, not by sheer arbitrary acts of will, as the Asherite view implies, but through wisdom and justice. Maimonides objects to this view on the ground that it is absurd to extend divine justice beyond the sphere of human agency. Just as the partisans of this view say that when a blameless person suffers, divine justice will provide him with a greater reward in the world to come, so they must also say that when a particular animal is killed, it was better for it to be so, and it will receive a recompense in the hereafter. This is a quote from Maimonides. They say in the same way that if this mouse, which has not sinned, is devoured by a cat or a hawk, God's wisdom has required this with regard to the mouse, and that the latter will receive compensation in the other world for what has happened to it. To Maimonides, it is disgraceful to put mice in the world to come. Maimonides' own view, having rejected these views of providence, Maimonides' own view is that in this sublunary realm, the only individuals to which God's providence extends are human beings. For all other creatures, providence covers only the species and their preservation. Everything else to individuals is left to chance, as the Aristotelian view claims. Moreover, for Maimonides, all of the events and activities of human life, without exception, are a matter of divine justice and therefore fall under providence. This is quote number 1 on the handout. I, for one, believe that in this lowly world, divine providence watches only over the individuals belonging to the human species, and that in this species alone all the circumstances of the individuals and the good and evil that befall them are consequent upon the deserts, just as it says, for all his ways are judgments. Thus, if a ship at sea is sunk by a storm, or a hard wind blows down a house, this is due to pure chance. Or more properly, it's not chance in that it's not a random, unregulated event of nature, but rather it occurs from the regular, but from the perspective of human expectations, unforeseen and uncontrollable causal order of nature, no less than the fact that a particular leaf has fallen off a tree at a particular moment. That's due to chance. The use of a ship at sea is actually quite touching for Maimonides. His brother David, whom he loved dearly, was a merchant, and when Maimonides, soon after Maimonides had moved to Egypt, his brother was on a ship at sea and died in a shipwreck in a storm. And Maimonides was devastated by this loss. And this image of ships going down at sea occurs in several places throughout his works. So the ship going down to sea, the house falling down on people, that's due to chance. But the fact that certain people had gone on board the ship that sunk, or that certain people had been sitting in the house that was blown down, is due not to chance, but to the divine will in accordance with the deserts of those people as determined by God's judgments. Now, one possible and even natural way of conceiving the divine modus operandi in providence for Maimonides needs to be ruled out from the start. There are passages in which Maimonides speaks as if God, seeing the virtues and vices of particular human beings, actively and intentionally chooses to reward and punish them as individuals, perhaps in just the way that the multitude think of providence, with God sending a thunderbolt against one person while snatching another person from the jaws of death. Thus, just as Maimonides insists that the people are on board the ship because of the divine will in accordance with the deserts of those people, so he elsewhere notes how the fate met by many people is due, and this is a quote, due not to the neglect and withdrawal of providence, but was a punishment for those men because they deserved what befell them. So sometimes he speaks in that sort of vulgar way of providence. But it is clear that this anthropomorphic way of acting, with God intervening to save or punish a person as if through a miracle, is inconsistent with what Maimonides considers the proper conception of God. And such language may only be an element of Maimonides' exoteric, as opposed to his esoteric writing, geared for the philosophically unsophisticated reader. On the contrary, in fact, God's role in providence is, so to speak, much more passive and naturalistic than that anthropomorphic version. For Maimonides, God has put a system in place that is there for individual human beings to take advantage of or not, as they choose. And it is the virtuous, understood as those who pursue intellectual virtue and not merely moral virtue. It's those virtuous people who choose to take advantage of this system, while everybody else is left without its protection. Here's how I think it works. Maimonides distinguishes between general providence, hashgacha minit, or providence of the kind, which is constituted by the species characteristics oriented towards its preservation, and is, barring unusual circumstances, provided equally to all members of the species. He distinguishes between that and individual providence, hashgacha ishit, providence of the individual human being, which is particularized to individuals and distributed only according to merits. So individual providence is according to merits. Both varieties of providence are understood in highly naturalistic and Aristotelian terms. However, only the latter, only individual providence, comes into play when it's a matter of human agency, and it comes into play only in the case of human agency. Only human beings enjoy particular providence. Individual or particular providence, Maimonides says, is a function of the overflow of knowledge from God through the separate intellects of the cosmos, including the agent intellect whose domain is the sublunary realm, finally down to the human intellect. A useful image to keep in mind here is sort of a wireless router. God's intellect is a wireless router, sending out this information And if you have the right server and connection, you can tap into this network of information. Keep that in mind as we go through these passages. So, to the extent that a person receives the overflow, to the extent that they tap into the network, they are under the protection of providence. This is quote number 2. Divine providence is consequent upon the divine overflow. Providence is consequent upon the intellect and attached to it. For providence can only come from an intelligent being, from one who is an intellect, for one perfect with a supreme perfection, than which there is no higher. Accordingly, everyone with whom something of this overflow is united will be reached by providence to the extent to which he is reached by the intellect. Individual providence is not an all or nothing affair, but proportionate to the degree to which a person is virtuous. Going back to our how many bars you've got. You can have all the bars, or you can only have some of the bars. That is proportionate to the degree to which this person has turned toward God, directed their attention to the knowledge flowing from God, and thereby perfected their intellect. This is quote number 3. When any individual has obtained, because of the disposition of his matter and his training, a greater proportion of this overflow than others, providence will of necessity watch more carefully over him than over others. That is, if that is to say, providence is, as I've mentioned, consequent upon the intellect. Accordingly, divine providence does not watch in an equal manner over all the individuals of the human species, but providence is graded as their human perfection is graded. In this sense, providence is a reward for intellectual virtue and the perfection of our highest faculties. And despite Maimonides' claim that the suffering of many is due not to the neglect and the withdrawal of providence, it seems clear that, in fact, it is precisely through approach and withdrawal, that is, the human being's willful approaching and to and withdrawing from the overflow, that's how providence operates. As long as one is actively enjoying the epistemic connection to the divine overflow, one is ipso facto protected. Providence is watching over, or better, engaged in such a person, and he or she is guarded from the vagaries of chance. On the other hand, when one is not attending to God, either because one has never made the effort, or because, having achieved the connection, one has temporarily become distracted, perhaps by the pleasures of the senses, one is abandoned to chance and left to one's own devices in the face of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. The person who is not experiencing the overflow is not enjoying its benefits. He is at the mercy of nature's elements, and his well-being is subject to whatever may or may not come his way. Providence is no longer watching over this person, not because God is actively punishing them, but because through their own actions he has taken himself outside of the care that providence, the overflow, offers, and is now exposed to whatever chance may bring. This is quote number 4. With regard to providence watching over excellent men and neglecting the ignorant, it is said, "He will keep the feet of his holy ones, but the wicked shall be put to silence and darkness, for not by strength shall men prevail." It says thereby that the fact that some individuals are preserved from calamities, whereas those befall others, is due not to their bodily forces and their natural dispositions, but to their perfection and deficiency. I mean their nearness to or remoteness from God. For this reason, those who are near to him are exceedingly well protected, whereas those who are far from him are given over to whatever may happen to befall them. For there is nothing to protect them against whatever may occur, for they are like one walking in darkness, whose destruction is assured. If you don't like the wireless router analogy, think of that insurance company that had the big red umbrella. You're either under the umbrella or you're not. And if you're not under the umbrella, it might be sunny on you, but it could also rain. Whereas if you're under the umbrella, you know you will not get wet. That was an old commercial on television, right? It sort of dates, well, it's 12th century, so it doesn't really date it. Those who do not strive for intellectual perfection have no more providential protection than non-human animals. They enjoy only general providence and whatever tools for survival the species confers upon them, as well as upon everybody else. For such people, there is a great deal of moral luck, insofar as their happiness and well-being is subject to chance, that is, to circumstances beyond their control. This brings us finally to the problem of what exactly Maimonides has in mind here. there is some ambiguity as to just what is the nature of the protection that